My wife's sister's wedding planner called. Your wife canceled your invitation, but asked to keep the $50,000 deposit you paid. I said, cancel the entire wedding. She gasped, but sir, you're not the groom dash. No, but I own the venue, the catering company, and the hotel chain they booked for guests. Tuesday mornings at Kingsley Group usually started the same way. Black coffee, financial reports spread across my mahogany desk, and the steady hum of Seattle's business district 30 floors below. I'd built this empire from nothing, starting with a single food truck and a dream that most people would have called crazy. Now, at 31, I was running a company worth more than most small countries' GDP, but nobody in my personal life seemed to give a damn about that part of my story. I was knee-deep in quarterly projections when my assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through my concentration like a knife through butter. Mr. Harland, there's a call from Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners online too. Her tone was professional as always, but I caught that slight hesitation that meant she wasn't sure if this was worth my time. Honestly, I almost hit the decline button right then and there. Wedding planners weren't exactly my usual clientele, at least not directly. But then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Ava's wedding. My sister-in-law was getting hitched next month to some hotshot doctor named Trevor, and the whole family had been buzzing about it for months. More importantly, I'd quietly cut a check for $50,000 to help cover the costs because Brooke, my wife of 7 years, had come to me with tears in her eyes talking about how her family was strapped for cash and couldn't afford the wedding Ava had always dreamed of. I'd written that check without thinking twice about it. No fanfare, no expectation of gratitude, no strings attached. Just a quiet gesture from a guy who'd grown up with nothing and understood what it meant to want something beautiful for the people you love. Hell, I didn't even want them to know it came from me. I'd specifically asked the wedding planner to keep my contribution anonymous. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones nobody knows you gave. Put them through, I told my assistant, straightening my tie and settling back into my leather chair. The Seattle skyline stretched out before me through floor-to-ceiling windows, a concrete jungle I'd learned to navigate and eventually conquer. But family stuff? That was still uncharted territory, even after all these years. Grayson Harland speaking. I said into the phone, using the same tone I'd use for any business call. Professional, direct, no nonsense. The voice on the other end was female, probably mid-30s, with that particular blend of nervousness and professionalism that told me this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. Mr. Harland, this is Eastlaw from Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners. I'm calling about the Henderson-Morrison wedding next month. She paused, and I could practically hear her choosing her words carefully. I'm afraid I have some rather uncomfortable news to share with you. My gut clenched. In my experience, when people started conversations with phrases like uncomfortable news, somebody was about to get screwed over, and it usually wasn't the person making the call. I'd heard those words plenty of times in business, right before a partner tried to snake a deal or a competitor attempted a hostile takeover. But this was supposed to be about a wedding, for Christ's sake. Go ahead, I said, keeping my voice level. I'd learned a long time ago that showing emotion in these situations was like showing your cards in poker. It never ended well. Well, sir, your wife contacted us yesterday with some specific requests regarding the guest arrangements. Another pause, longer this time. She requested that your name be removed from the guest list entirely. She also inquired about whether the $50,000 deposit you provided could remain with us, given that the funds have already been allocated to various vendors. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral, staring out at the city below. Cars moved like ants along the streets, people going about their business, completely unaware that my world had just shifted on its axis. Removed from the guest list. My own sister-in-law's wedding. The wedding I'd bankrolled out of love and generosity. They'd taken my money and kicked me to the curb like some unwanted party crasher. I felt that familiar coldness settle over me. The same ice-cold calm that had helped me close billion-dollar deals and survive in a business world that ate nice guys for breakfast. It was the kind of calm that made smart people nervous and stupid people overconfident. I see, I said finally, my voice carrying none of the rage that was building in my chest like a pressure cooker. And did my wife provide any reasoning for this request? She mentioned something about wanting to avoid potential drama, and keeping the celebration focused on the happy couple, Isla replied, clearly uncomfortable with having to relay this message. She assured us that you would understand and that the financial contribution was intended as a gift regardless of your attendance. A gift? 7 years of marriage. And my wife thought she could erase me from a family celebration like I was some embarrassing relative who drank too much at parties. The woman who'd cried in my arms about her family's financial struggles, who'd begged me to help make her sister's day special, had just stabbed me in the back with a smile. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of power settling around my shoulders like an expensive suit. There was something almost poetic about this moment. The quiet guy they'd all underestimated was about to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Cancel the entire wedding, I said calmly, as if I was ordering lunch instead of dropping a nuclear bomb on what was supposed to be the happiest day of two people's lives. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I almost wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Isla's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers rustling frantically. I'm sorry, Mr. Harland, but I don't think I understand. You want to cancel your attendance? No, I replied, leaning back in my chair and allowing myself the smallest of smiles. I want you to cancel the entire wedding. All of it. Every vendor, every service, every reservation. Cancel it all. But sir, she stammered, you're not the groom. I don't have the authority to. Actually, I interrupted, my voice still perfectly calm. I think you'll find that you do. The stunned silence on the other end of the line was absolutely delicious. I could practically hear Isla's brain scrambling to process what I'd just told her, probably flipping through contracts and vendor agreements like her life depended on it. In the business world, I'd learned to appreciate these moments. The split second when someone realizes they've been playing checkers while you've been playing chess the entire time. But sir, she finally managed, her voice shaking slightly, you're not the groom. I don't understand how you could possibly have the authority to cancel an entire wedding that you're not even technically part of anymore. I leaned back in my executive chair, the buttery leather creaking softly as I shifted position. Through my office windows, Seattle stretched out below me like a kingdom I'd conquered one deal at a time. The Space Needle pierced the cloudy morning sky in the distance, and for a moment I felt like I was looking down at my own personal chessboard, ready to make the move that would change everything. You're absolutely right, Isla, I said, letting a hint of amusement creep into my voice. I'm not the groom. But here's the thing that nobody in my wife's family seems to understand. I don't need to be the groom to control this entire situation. I could hear her breathing quicken on the other end of the line, probably sensing that she was about to learn something that would flip her world upside down. I'd been in her shoes before, back when I was young and naive enough to think that the person sitting across from you in a business meeting was always exactly who they appeared to be. Let me paint you a picture, Isla. You work for Magnolia and Pine Wedding Planners, correct? Nice little company. Been around for about 8 years now. Specializes in high-end celebrations for Seattle's elite families. I'm sure you're proud to work there. Yes, sir, she whispered, and I could tell she was starting to put the pieces together even though she probably didn't want to believe what her gut was telling her. Well, here's something that might interest you. Magnolia and Pine is owned by a larger company called Landmark Events, which handles event planning and hospitality services throughout the Pacific Northwest. And Landmark Events? That falls under the umbrella of my holding company, Harlan Ventures. I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the knockout punch. Which means, technically speaking, you work for me. The gas that came through the phone was so sharp I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered my wife's smug text about keeping my $50,000 and calling my legitimate hurt feelings drama. And any sympathy I might have felt evaporated like morning mist. Oh my God, she breathed, and I could hear papers rustling frantically in the background. She was probably pulling up corporate documents, trying to verify what I'd just told her, hoping against hope that I was bluffing or mistaken. But wait, there's more. I continued, channeling my inner infomercial host. The venue where this wedding is supposed to take place, Willowcrest Estate? That gorgeous property with the gardens and the lakefront view that Ava's been gushing about for months? Yeah, that's mine too. I bought it 3 years ago through a subsidiary called Pacific Properties. Beautiful place, isn't it? I particularly love what we've done with the rose garden. Silence. Complete. Total silence. I imagined Isla sitting at her desk, probably staring at her computer screen in horror as she realized the full scope of what she was dealing with. In the background, I could hear the faint sounds of her office, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the normal soundtrack of people going about their business completely unaware that their colleague was having her entire understanding of reality rearranged. And since we're on the topic, I continued, feeling like a magician revealing the secret behind an impossible trick. Let's talk about Crown Fork Catering. You know, the company that's supposed to be handling the reception dinner? The one with the award-winning chef and the 5-star reputation? I own that too. Bought them out 2 years ago when they were struggling with debt. Turned them into one of the most sought-after catering companies on the West Coast. I stood up and walked over to my window, looking down at the city that had taught me everything I knew about power, money, and the importance of keeping your cards close to your chest. Down there, millions of people were going about their daily lives, most of them completely unaware that the quiet guy they might pass on the street controlled a significant chunk of their city's hospitality industry. Oh, and Grandon Hotels, I added, almost as an afterthought. That's the chain where all 120 wedding guests have their reservations, right? The beautiful historic property downtown with the marble lobby and the panoramic city views? Guess what? That's part of my portfolio too. I acquired the entire chain last year when they were expanding into the Pacific Northwest market. The sound that came through the phone wasn't quite a sob, but it wasn't far off. I'd just systematically dismantled this woman's understanding of the situation, revealing that every single vendor, every venue, every service provider connected to this wedding ultimately answered to me. So you see, Isla, I said, my voice returning to that calm, professional tone that had served me so well in boardrooms and negotiation tables. While I may not be the groom, I am quite literally the foundation that this entire celebration is built on. Every contract traces back to me. Every service provider works for companies I own. Every reservation was made at properties I control. I could hear her breathing heavily now, probably trying to figure out how to handle a situation that wasn't covered in any wedding planning manual. Send cancellation notices to all vendors immediately, I instructed, my voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. Refund any deposits that the guests paid directly. And bill my wife's family for the remaining balance of all services, minus the $50,000 I'm keeping as a cancellation fee for their disrespect. Mr. Harland, she whispered, are you sure about this? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. After I hung up with Isla, I sat back in my chair and let out a long breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a guy worth more than $2.5 billion, and my own wife's family had spent the last 7 years treating me like I was some kind of charity case who'd lucked into marrying above his station. The thing is, I'd never told Brooke or her family who I really was. Not completely, anyway. When people asked what I did for a living, I'd just say I ran a small business and leave it at that. It wasn't exactly a lie. Kingsley Group had started small, just me and a beat-up food truck I'd bought with my last $2,000 after dropping out of law school. But somewhere along the way, that little business had grown into something that would make most Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. I'd never felt the need to brag about it, you know? Money talks, but wealth whispers, and I'd always preferred the whisper approach. Maybe it was because I'd grown up dirt poor in a trailer park outside Tacoma, watching my mom work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. When you've been hungry, really hungry, not just I skipped lunch, hungry, you learn that flashy displays of wealth are usually just insecurity wearing a designer suit. But Brooke's family? They'd never learned that lesson. They were middle-class folks who'd built their entire identity around keeping up appearances and making sure everyone knew exactly where they stood in the social pecking order. And in their minds, I was definitely at the bottom of that order. Take Trevor, for instance, Ava's fiancé and the golden boy of the family. Dr. Trevor Morrison, with his perfectly styled hair, his BMW, and his habit of mentioning his medical degree in casual conversation like it was some kind of magic spell that made everyone automatically respect him. The guy made decent money, sure, probably pulled in around $300,000 a year, which isn't pocket change by any stretch. But compared to what I was sitting on, he might as well have been flipping burgers. Yet every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual get-together inevitably turned into the Trevor Appreciation Hour. Did you hear Trevor just bought a new house? Trevor's getting promoted to chief of cardiology. Trevor's so stable and successful. Ava's so lucky. And then there was me, sitting quietly at the end of the table like some kind of furniture that everyone had gotten used to ignoring. The guy who showed up in jeans and a button-down shirt while Trevor was sporting his designer threads. The guy who drove a 5-year-old Ford F-150 instead of a luxury sedan. The guy who never talked about work because, honestly, what was I supposed to say? Oh, I just closed a deal to acquire a hotel chain in Vancouver. How was your day? Dennis and Lorraine, Brooke's parents, had made their feelings about me crystal clear from day one. They'd never said it outright. They were too polite for that. But the message came through loud and clear in 1,000 little ways. The way Dennis would talk business with Trevor at dinner while completely ignoring me. The way Lorraine would gush about Trevor's achievements while giving me these sympathetic little smiles like I was some kind of wounded puppy she felt sorry for. I'll never forget this one dinner about 2 years ago. We were all sitting around their dining room table, and Dennis was going on and on about Trevor's latest promotion. Finally, he turned to me with this condescending smile and said, "Well, Grayson, at least Ava's marrying someone stable. Someone with real prospects, you know." The implication was clear as day. Unlike you, the guy who married our other daughter and clearly peaked in high school. I just nodded and said something non-committal about Trevor being a good guy, which he actually was, despite his family's annoying habit of treating him like the second coming of Jesus Christ. But that comment had stuck with me, eating away at my gut like acid. At least Ava's marrying someone stable. As if I was some kind of deadbeat who couldn't provide for his wife. Some loser who'd somehow conned their precious daughter into settling for less than she deserved. The truth was, I'd been supporting Brooke financially for years without making a big deal about it. When she wanted to go back to school to get her master's degree, who do you think paid for it? When her car died and she needed a replacement, who cut the check? When she decided she wanted to start her own little boutique business that never quite got off the ground, who funded that pipe dream? Me. Every single time. It was me writing the checks and telling her not to worry about paying me back because we were married and what was mine was hers. I'd done it all quietly, without fanfare, because that's what you do for the people you love. You take care of them, and you don't make them feel small about needing help. But apparently, taking care of your family financially doesn't count as being stable if you do it without bragging about it every 5 minutes. I dropped out of law school at 24 because I'd seen an opportunity that most people would have called crazy. Food trucks were just starting to become a thing, and I'd had this vision of building something bigger, something that could eventually expand into catering, then venues, then hospitality. My professors thought I'd lost my mind. My classmates figured I'd flunk out of the real world within 6 months. Instead, I'd built an empire. 40 venues across 3 states, 18 catering companies with 5-star reputations, 9 hotel properties that were booked solid year-round, and a dozen other vendor companies that most people had never heard of but that quietly dominated their respective markets. But according to my in-laws, I was just the quiet guy who ran some small business and would never measure up to their precious Dr. Trevor. Well, they were about to learn exactly what my small business could do when it decided to flex its muscles. And something told me that by the time this was all over, they'd have a very different understanding of what stable actually looked like. I was still sitting there, processing the nuclear bomb I'd just dropped on Isla and trying to figure out my next move, when my phone buzzed against my desk like an angry wasp. The screen lit up with Brooke's name, and for just a split second, I felt that familiar flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to tell me there'd been some horrible misunderstanding, to explain that she'd never meant to cut me out of her sister's wedding like I was some kind of unwanted relative. But it wasn't a call. It was a text. And the moment I read those words, whatever small piece of my heart that still belonged to my wife of 7 years crumbled into dust. Please don't cause drama. You're not coming to Ava's wedding. We'll be keeping the money. You offered it as a gift anyway. Let's talk when you've calmed down. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over again, each word hitting me like a physical blow. The casual dismissal of my feelings. The assumption that I was being dramatic for being hurt by their betrayal. The entitled way she talked about keeping my $50,000 like it was pocket change she'd found in the couch cushions. But what really got to me, what made something cold and hard settle in my chest like a stone, was that phrase. Let's talk when you've calmed down. Calm down. Like I was some kind of unhinged lunatic throwing a temper tantrum instead of a man who'd just discovered that his own wife had orchestrated his humiliation behind his back. Like my perfectly reasonable response to being erased from a family celebration I'd bankrolled was just some irrational emotional outburst that would pass once I came to my senses. I'd been with Brooke for 7 years. 7 years of marriage, 2 years of dating before that. 9 years of my life invested in this woman. And she thought she could just text me like I was some casual acquaintance she was blowing off for lunch plans. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you punch walls and say things you'll regret later. No, this was the cold, calculating kind of fury that had helped me crush competitors and close impossible deals. This was the kind of anger that didn't cloud your judgment. It sharpened it like a blade. Because here's what really hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Ava's wedding. This was about Brooke too. My wife, the woman who'd promised to love, honor, and cherish me until death do us part, had been the mastermind behind this whole thing. She wasn't some innocent bystander who'd gotten caught up in her family's drama. She was the one who'd called the wedding planner and asked to have my name removed from the guest list. She was the one who'd inquired about keeping my money while kicking me to the curb. I thought back to all those conversations we'd had about the wedding over the past few months. Brooke coming to me with tears in her eyes, talking about how stressed Ava was about the costs, how her parents were struggling financially, how heartbroken her sister would be if she couldn't have the wedding of her dreams. I'd written that check without hesitation because I'd thought I was helping my family, our family. But apparently, I'd been wrong about that, our part. The woman I'd supported through graduate school, the woman whose car payments I'd covered when she was between jobs, the woman whose failed business ventures I'd funded without complaint. She'd been planning to humiliate me this entire time. While I was writing checks and playing the role of the generous brother-in-law, she'd been plotting with her family about how to cut me out of the picture once my usefulness had expired. I wondered how long they'd been planning this. Had it been weeks? Months? Had they all been sitting around the dinner table, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate the quiet guy who never fought back? Had Brooke been texting her sister about what a pushover her husband was, how he'd pay for anything if you just gave him a sob story and some crocodile tears? The betrayal cut deeper than any business deal gone wrong, any competitor's dirty trick, any setback I'd ever faced in building my empire. Because this wasn't just about money or power or business. This was about the person I'd trusted most in the world deciding that I was disposable. I thought about all the times I'd defended Brooke to people who'd suggested she might be using me. Colleagues who'd made jokes about trophy wives and gold diggers. Friends who'd raised eyebrows when they found out I was paying for her lifestyle without getting much in return. I'd always shut those conversations down, insisting that Brooke loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. Turns out I'd been the only one who actually believed that. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Brooke. Gray, I know you're upset, but please try to understand. This is Ava's day, and we can't have any family drama ruining it. You'll get over this. You'll get over this. Like being erased from my own family was just some minor inconvenience I'd eventually forget about. Like 7 years of marriage meant so little to her that she could just wave her hand and expect me to accept being treated like garbage. I deleted both messages without responding. There was nothing to say to her right now, nothing that wouldn't make things worse than they already were. Besides, I had a feeling that very soon, Brooke was going to understand exactly what kind of drama her family had just invited into their lives. And somehow, I doubted she was going to get over it nearly as easily as she expected me to. I didn't have to wait long to see the results of my handiwork. In the business world, I'd learned that information travels at the speed of panic and wedding cancellations. They spread through family networks faster than wildfire through dry brush. I was nursing my third cup of coffee and pretending to review some acquisition reports when my phone started ringing off the hook. The first call came exactly 45 minutes after I'd hung up with Isla. The caller ID showed Dennis Whitmore, my father-in-law, the man who'd spent the better part of 7 years treating me like I was some kind of charity case his daughter had dragged home out of misplaced sympathy. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, just to let him sweat a little. Grayson. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic, and I could hear Lorraine yelling something in the background that sounded like a wounded animal. What the hell is going on? Why is Ava's wedding canceled? The planner just called and said all the vendors are backing out. I leaned back in my chair, watching a seagull perch on the ledge outside my office window. Even from 30 floors up, that bird looked more dignified than the man currently hyperventilating into my ear. Because you uninvited me, Dennis, I said calmly, like I was explaining basic math to a kindergartner. And as it turns out, I own everything you booked for this little celebration. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking on my office wall. Then Dennis made this choking sound, like someone had just punched him in the solar plexus. You can't be serious, he finally managed. This is about your feelings getting hurt? You're going to ruin your sister-in-law's wedding because you're throwing some kind of tantrum. That word, tantrum, hit me like a slap in the face. The same dismissive language Brooke had used in her text, the same condescending tone I'd been hearing from this family for years. Like my legitimate anger at being betrayed and humiliated was just some childish outburst that reasonable adults should ignore. I'm completely serious, I replied, my voice still steady as a rock. You decided I wasn't worthy of attending a wedding I paid for. I decided that if I'm not good enough to be a guest, then maybe this celebration shouldn't happen at all. But Grayson, Dennis pleaded, and now I could hear genuine desperation creeping into his voice. This will destroy Ava. She's been planning this for over a year. All our relatives are flying in from across the country. Should have thought about that before you cut me out, I said, and hung up. The phone immediately started ringing again, but this time it was Trevor. Dr. Trevor Morrison, the golden boy himself, probably calling to smooth things over with his charm and his medical degree and his natural assumption that everyone would just fall in line once he applied his considerable people skills to the situation. Grayson, man, I don't know what happened between you and the family, but we really need to fix this, he said the moment I picked up. His voice had that careful, measured tone doctors use when they're trying to calm down an agitated patient. I've got colleagues flying in from Chicago, my parents drove up from California yesterday, and Ava's cousins are already at the hotel. We can work through whatever this is, but we need the wedding to happen. Not my concern, Trevor, I said, and I meant it. For all his faults, Trevor had never been actively disrespectful to me. He'd just been oblivious to how his golden boy status made everyone else in the family feel invisible. But right now, I was past caring about collateral damage. Look, I get that you're upset about something, but surely we can find a compromise here. What's it going to take to make this right? Wait, I said, genuinely curious now. Are you telling me you don't even know what your fiancée and her family did? They didn't bother to fill you in on their little plan? What plan? Grayson, I'm completely lost here. All I know is that our wedding is apparently canceled, and somehow you're involved. Despite everything, I almost felt sorry for the guy. Here he was, thinking he was marrying into a normal family with normal problems, completely unaware that his future in-laws had just declared war on the man who'd been quietly bankrolling their lifestyle for years. Ask your fiancée, I said. Ask her to explain why I got uninvited from a wedding I paid 50 grand for. Ask her why her family thought it was a good idea to keep my money while kicking me to the curb. Another pause, longer this time. When Trevor spoke again, his voice had changed, less doctor-patient calm, more genuine confusion and growing concern. You paid for the wedding? But I thought. Ava said her parents were handling most of the costs. Nope, that was me. $50,000, paid quietly because I thought I was helping family. Turns out I was just being played for a sucker. Jesus Christ, Trevor breathed. I had no idea. Grayson, if this is true, then what they did is completely inexcusable. But please, man, Ava doesn't deserve to pay for her family's stupidity. She's been dreaming about this day since she was a little girl. Then maybe she should have married into a family that knows how to treat people with basic human decency. I replied. Wait, hold on. Are you seriously telling me that you actually own all the vendors? The venue, the catering, all of it? Check the contracts, Trevor. They all trace back to companies I own. Your beautiful wedding venue? Mine. The 5-star catering you've been bragging about? Mine. The hotel where all your guests are staying? Also mine. The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then Trevor let out a long, shaky breath. Holy shit, Grayson. You're not just some guy who runs a small business, are you? Not even close, I said, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to smile. The calls kept coming like waves crashing against a seawall, each one more desperate than the last. I turned my phone to silent, but I could see it lighting up every few minutes with different numbers. Dennis calling back, Lorraine sobbing into voicemails, Ava's number flashing repeatedly like a distress signal. But it was Isla who called back first, her voice now carrying the kind of professional panic that told me she'd spent the last hour making phone calls that had systematically destroyed her faith in the wedding industry. Mr. Harland, she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. I've been making calls for the past 2 hours, and I'm afraid I have some rather devastating news for the Henderson-Morrison families. I leaned back in my chair, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through my office windows. Down below, Seattle was going about its business, completely unaware that somewhere in the city, 2 families were learning a very expensive lesson about burning bridges with the wrong person. Let me guess, I said, not bothering to hide my amusement. You can't find replacement vendors for their date. It's worse than that, sir. There's literally nothing available in the entire Pacific Northwest region for their wedding date. I've called every venue within a 300-mile radius, every catering company, every florist, every photographer. The few places that even have availability are either completely inappropriate for a wedding of this scale, or— She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. Well, they're also owned by companies that trace back to your holdings. That made me laugh. Actually laugh out loud. In all my years of building Kingsley Group, I'd never quite realized just how much of the regional hospitality market I'd managed to corner. It hadn't been intentional, just good business sense. When you see a profitable company in your industry struggling with debt or management issues, you buy it. When you find a property with potential that the current owners are mismanaging, you acquire it. Do that consistently for 15 years, and apparently you end up owning most of the wedding infrastructure in 3 states. What about out of state? I asked, genuinely curious about how far they'd be willing to go to avoid dealing with me directly. I tried California, Oregon, even as far south as Nevada. The problem is the timeline. We're talking about a wedding that's supposed to happen in 3 weeks. Most quality venues are booked a year in advance, and the ones that do have last-minute availability are— She trailed off diplomatically. Or what, Isla? Don't spare my feelings. Are not the kind of places where Dr. Morrison's colleagues would expect to attend a wedding, she said carefully. We're talking about VFW halls, community centers, maybe a few restaurants that could clear out their dining rooms. Nothing that would accommodate 120 guests with the level of service and elegance that was originally planned. I could picture it now. Trevor trying to explain to his fancy doctor friends why they were eating rubber chicken in a Knights of Columbus hall instead of the 5-star lakefront celebration they'd been promised. The thought was almost too delicious to bear. Even more problematic, Isla continued, is the fact that all the guests have already made travel arrangements. Flights, hotel reservations, rental cars. Most of these people took time off work, arranged childcare, spent money they can't get back. If we relocate the wedding to a different state or even a different city, we're essentially asking them to start over with their travel plans. And how are the families taking this news? I asked, though I had a pretty good idea based on the 17 missed calls on my phone. Not well, she said with what might have been the understatement of the year. Mrs. Whitmore has been crying for the past hour. Ava locked herself in her room and won't come out. Mr. Whitmore has been making increasingly frantic calls to every contact he has in the hospitality industry, trying to call in favors that apparently don't exist. I felt a small pang of something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly when I remembered Brooke's text about keeping my money and talking when I'd calmed down. Sometimes the only way to make people understand the value of something is to take it away from them. And Dr. Morrison? I asked. He's been trying to manage the situation, making calls to his colleagues to explain the delay, attempting to negotiate with vendors directly. But sir, she hesitated, he also asked me to give you a message. Oh, this should be good. He wanted me to tell you that he had no knowledge of your removal from the guest list, and that he considers what his fiancé's family did to be completely unacceptable. He asked if there might be some way to resolve this situation that wouldn't punish Ava for her family's poor judgment. Interesting. So Trevor was trying to play peacemaker, positioning himself as the reasonable voice caught in the middle of a family drama he didn't create. I had to give him credit. It was a smart play, and honestly, it was probably the truth. The guy might be a little full of himself, but he'd never struck me as malicious. Did he now? I said. And what did you tell him? I told him that any resolution would have to come directly from you, and that my job was simply to coordinate services, not negotiate family disputes. Smart woman. She was learning to stay in her lane, which was probably a survival skill in her line of work. Isla, I said, making a decision that surprised even me. Tell the families that there is one option available to them. Just one. I could hear her scrambling for a pen. Yes, sir, what would that be? There's a property called Willow Fern Lodge about 40 minutes outside the city. It's smaller than what they originally planned. Rustic charm, mountain views, that sort of thing. It could work for their date. Oh, thank God, she breathed. I'll call them immediately, Anne. Isla, I interrupted gently. Yes, sir. That's one of mine too. The silence that followed was so profound I wondered if she'd hung up on me. Mr. Harland, she finally whispered. Exactly how much of the hospitality industry in this region do you own? I smiled, watching a cloud drift past my office window. More than enough. The desperation in Isla's voice was almost palpable through the phone line, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't enjoying every second of it. Not because I took pleasure in her suffering, she was just doing her job, after all, but because her panic was a direct reflection of the chaos that Brooke and her family were experiencing right about now. The same people who'd spent years making me feel like an afterthought were finally getting a taste of what it felt like to be powerless. Mr. Harland, Isla said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to tell these families anymore. I've exhausted every option I can think of. Is there truly no way to make this work? I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the weight of absolute control. In the business world, this was the moment I lived for. When the other party finally understood that all their options led through me, that I held all the cards and they were completely at my mercy. It was intoxicating in a way that most people would never understand. Actually, Isla, I said slowly, there is one path forward. But it's going to require the families to make some very difficult decisions. I could hear her intake of breath, the sound of someone grasping at a lifeline. Anything, sir? At this point, I think they'd agree to almost any terms. Almost any terms, I repeated, chuckling softly. We'll see about that. I stood up and walked over to my window, looking down at the city that had taught me everything I knew about power dynamics and negotiation. Sometimes the best deals were the ones where you didn't just win. You made sure everyone else understood exactly why they'd lost. Here's what I'm prepared to offer, I said, my voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone I used in boardroom acquisitions. I'll make Pinebrook Pavilion available for their date. It's one of my smaller properties, about an hour outside the city, but it has its charm. Mountain views, rustic elegance, that whole organic aesthetic that's so popular these days. That sounds wonderful, Isla said, relief flooding her voice. What would be the— I'm not finished, I interrupted. The guest list will be capped at 60 people. Not negotiable. The venue simply can't accommodate the original 120, and frankly, after the way I've been treated, I'm not inclined to make special arrangements. I could hear her scribbling notes frantically. 60 guests, understood. And the catering arrangements. House menu only. No special requests. No dietary accommodations beyond basic vegetarian options. No custom cocktails. They'll get what I'm willing to provide, and they'll be grateful for it. Of course, sir. And the other services? Simple floral package, seasonal arrangements, nothing exotic or imported. One staff photographer for basic coverage, no elaborate photo shoots or artistic nonsense. The whole thing will be functional and dignified, but it won't be the fairy tale celebration they originally envisioned. I paused, letting her absorb the reality of what I was offering. This wasn't going to be the Instagram-worthy extravaganza that Ava had been planning for months. This was going to be a nice, modest wedding that would serve as a constant reminder of what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. And the price? Isla asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected this was where the other shoe would drop. $180,000, I said calmly, as if I was discussing the weather instead of demanding 4 times what the original wedding had cost. Payable in full, in advance, before any services are rendered. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When Isla finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, that's 4 times what the original wedding cost. Even accounting for the last-minute arrangements and the premium for short notice, that seems excessive," I suggested. "Unreasonable? Maybe even vindictive." "I wasn't going to say vindictive," she said quickly. "But you were thinking it," I replied. "And you know what? You're absolutely right. It is vindictive. It's also the price of burning bridges with the man who was holding them up in the first place." I could hear voices in the background, probably the families gathered around Isla's desk, hanging on every word of our conversation like their lives depended on it. Which, in a way, they did. But that's not all. I continued, savoring the moment like a fine wine. "The price is contingent on 2 additional conditions that are completely non-negotiable." "What conditions?" Isla asked, though she sounded like someone asking about the terms of their own execution. "First, my invitation to the wedding must be reinstated. Not grudgingly, not as an afterthought, but with a formal, written apology from Brooke and her parents acknowledging that their treatment of me was unacceptable." "And the second condition?" I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "The apology has to be read aloud during the reception, in front of all 60 guests, so everyone understands exactly why this wedding nearly didn't happen." The gasp that came through the phone was audible even over the background chaos. Someone, probably Lorraine, let out what sounded like a wounded animal cry. "Mr. Harland," Isla said carefully, "I understand that you're hurt and angry, but asking them to publicly humiliate themselves at their daughter's wedding seems like exactly the kind of public humiliation they were planning to put me through," I finished. "The only difference is that now they understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end." I walked back to my desk and sat down, feeling more in control than I had in years. "Those are my terms, Isla. $180,000, a formal written apology, and a public acknowledgement of their mistakes. They have 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires and they can explain to their relatives why there's no wedding at all. And if they refuse, then Ava can get married at the courthouse like millions of other people do every year. It might not be the fairy tale she dreamed of, but it'll be a lot cheaper than learning the hard way that actions have consequences." 2 days later, I was sitting in the main conference room at Kingsley Hall, my company's private estate that I rarely used for anything other than high-stakes business meetings. The room was designed to intimidate: 20-foot ceilings, oil paintings of Seattle's founding fathers, and a mahogany table that had probably cost more than most people's cars. If Brooke's family wanted to negotiate, they were going to do it on my turf, surrounded by reminders of exactly who they were dealing with. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit like it had been painted on, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a Patek Philippe watch that I'd bought to celebrate my first billion-dollar acquisition. Not because I needed to impress them, that ship had sailed, but because I wanted them to see, maybe for the first time, who I really was when I wasn't playing the role of the quiet, accommodating family member. They filed in like condemned prisoners approaching the gallows. Brooke came first, looking pale and nervous in a way I hadn't seen since our early dating days. Her usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the uncertain posture of someone who'd finally realized they'd been playing a game with rules they didn't understand. Behind her came Ava and Trevor, followed by Dennis and Lorraine bringing up the rear like reluctant participants in their own intervention. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. These were the same people who'd spent years talking over me at dinner tables, dismissing my opinions, treating me like furniture that they'd grown accustomed to ignoring. Now they sat in my conference room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power they'd never bothered to notice, finally understanding that the quiet guy they'd been overlooking was actually the one holding all the cards. Lorraine looked like she'd been crying for days, her mascara slightly smudged despite obvious attempts to repair it. Dennis kept fidgeting with his tie, a nervous habit I'd observed during family dinners when he was uncomfortable. Ava sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table like she was trying to will herself invisible. I let the silence stretch for a full minute before speaking, enjoying the way they all tensed when I finally opened my mouth. "I'm here because I value family," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority that had served me well in countless negotiations. even when family seems to forget my value. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what they were meant to be. I watched as shame flickered across their faces, the uncomfortable recognition of their own behavior reflected back at them. Ava was the first to break, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grayson, I didn't know. I swear to God, I had no idea you were the one who paid for everything, or that you owned all the venues. If I'd known, you'd have what?" I asked, not unkindly, but not letting her off the hook either. "Treated me with basic human decency? Insisted that the man who bankrolled your wedding deserved an invitation to attend it." Brooke shifted uncomfortably in her chair, finally finding her voice. "Gray, I thought you'd understand. I was trying to avoid family drama, keep things simple. Understand being humiliated and used." I interrupted, my tone still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room freeze. "Understand having my generosity thrown back in my face while you kept my money? No, Brooke, I don't understand that at all." The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Instead of the arrogant dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from this family, there was something that looked suspiciously like genuine remorse. Then Trevor did something that surprised me. He stood up slowly, his face serious, and looked me directly in the eye. "Grayson," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I want to apologize. Not just for myself, but for all of us. What Brooke and her family did was completely wrong, and there's no excuse for it." He paused, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I'd be honored if you came to our wedding, not as some obligation or because you paid for it, but as a guest, and as a man I now deeply respect." The room went completely quiet. For the first time since this whole mess started, someone in Brooke's family was actually listening to me instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. And despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the humiliation and the casual cruelty they'd shown me, I felt something shift in my chest. Maybe it was respect for Trevor's honesty, or maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying all this anger around for the past few days. For the first time in years, they were actually treating me like I mattered. They accepted my offer. All of it. The $180,000, paid in full by Dennis with what I suspected was a significant chunk of his retirement savings and a second mortgage on their house. The formal written apology, signed by Brooke and her parents in language that left no doubt about how badly they'd screwed up. And the public acknowledgement, which they agreed to with the kind of resigned acceptance that comes from knowing you've burned every other bridge available to you. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in the main hall of Pinebrook Pavilion, watching as the final touches were put on what had become a surprisingly elegant celebration. The venue was smaller than what they'd originally planned, sure, but the mountain views were spectacular, and the rustic charm of the exposed beams and stone fireplace gave the whole thing a warmth that the original lakefront estate might have lacked. 60 guests instead of 120, but every person in that room understood they were witnessing something special. Word had gotten out, as word always does in situations like this, about the drama that had nearly canceled the wedding entirely. The story had been sanitized in the retelling, of course, but the basic facts were clear. Grayson Harland, the quiet guy everyone had underestimated, had turned out to be the puppet master pulling all the strings. I stood at my assigned table, wearing another perfectly tailored suit and watching as people I'd known for years looked at me with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and what might have been a healthy dose of fear. The same relatives who'd always greeted me with polite but dismissive small talk were now approaching me with the kind of deference usually reserved for minor celebrities or visiting dignitaries. "Grayson," Brooke's Uncle Mike had said during cocktail hour, "I had no idea you were in the hospitality business. Dennis mentioned you own quite a few properties around here." "A few," I'd replied with the kind of understatement that was becoming my signature response to these conversations. The ceremony itself had been beautiful in its simplicity. Ava looked stunning in her dress, her earlier tears replaced by genuine joy as she exchanged vows with Trevor. The groom, to his credit, had handled the entire situation with more grace than I'd expected, treating me with the kind of respect that made me think he might actually be worthy of joining this family. But it was during the reception that the real moment of reckoning came. Trevor stood up during the toasts, champagne glass in hand, and looked out over the assembled guests with the confidence of a man who'd made peace with an uncomfortable truth. The room fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying clearly in the intimate space. "Before we continue with the celebration," he said, "I want to take a moment to thank someone who made this day possible in ways that most of you probably don't fully understand." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, and for a moment, I was transported back to all those family dinners where I'd been the invisible man at the end of the table. Except this time, instead of being ignored, I was the center of attention. To Grayson Harland, Trevor continued, raising his glass higher. "The man who reminded us all not to mistake humility for weakness. You didn't just build this wedding. You rebuilt this family's integrity." The applause that followed was genuine, not the polite golf claps I'd grown accustomed to at family gatherings. Even Lorraine, who'd barely been able to look at me during the ceremony, wiped away a tear as she joined in. Ava stood up from the head table, her eyes bright with emotion. "Grayson," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "I owe you an apology that I should have given you years ago. You've been nothing but generous and kind to our family, and we repaid that kindness with disrespect and betrayal. I'm sorry, and I'm grateful, not just for what you did to save my wedding, but for the lesson you taught us about treating people with the respect they deserve." The room erupted in applause again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just polite acknowledgement. This was recognition. For the first time in 7 years of being part of this family, they were actually seeing me for who I was instead of who they assumed I must be. Brooke had remained silent throughout the toasts, but as the evening wore on, I caught her watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. When the dancing started and people began to mingle, she finally approached me, a glass of wine in her hand and something that looked like genuine remorse in her eyes. "I didn't know you were this powerful," she whispered, standing close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same scent she'd worn on our first date 9 years ago. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman I'd loved for nearly a decade, and felt something that might have been sadness. "You never asked," I replied softly, and walked away to join the celebration of a family that had finally learned to see me clearly. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in my penthouse apartment to the sound of rain pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seattle was doing what Seattle does best, washing yesterday's drama away with a steady downpour that made the city look clean and new. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee when I heard Brooke's key turning in the lock, followed by the familiar sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floors. She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like she hadn't slept much, still wearing yesterday's makeup and the kind of expression that told me she'd spent the night rehearsing whatever speech she was about to deliver. In her hand was a bouquet of flowers, expensive ones, the kind you get from a real florist instead of the grocery store, and her eyes had that desperate brightness that meant she was operating on pure adrenaline and hope. "Gray," she said, setting the flowers on the granite countertop like a peace offering. "We need to talk. About us, about what happened, about what comes next." I took another sip of my coffee and looked at her over the rim of my mug. This woman who'd shared my bed for 7 years, who'd cried in my arms about her family's financial problems, who'd systematically erased me from one of the most important celebrations in her sister's life. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of finally understanding who she'd been married to all this time. "Maybe we can work on us," she continued, her voice carrying that tentative hope that people use when they're trying to rebuild something they've accidentally destroyed. "I know I messed up, Gray. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But we've been together for 7 years. That has to count for something, right?" I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter, the small clink echoing in the sudden silence. Behind her, through the kitchen window, I could see my Tesla Model S Plaid parked in the building's private garage, the luggage already loaded in the back. I'd packed it the night before, while she was still at the wedding reception, probably networking with the same people who'd spent years treating me like furniture. "Brooke," I said quietly, "you weren't just silent during the betrayal. You planned it." The words hit her like a physical blow, and I watched as her face crumpled with the realization that there was no walking back from what she'd done. She'd orchestrated my humiliation, coordinated with her family to cut me out of a celebration I'd bankrolled, and then had the audacity to text me about keeping my money and talking when I'd calmed down. "But Gray," I was trying to avoid drama. "By creating drama," I interrupted, standing up from the kitchen island. "By lying to me, manipulating me, and treating me like a checkbook with legs instead of like your husband." I walked past her toward the hallway, where my overnight bag was already waiting by the door. 7 years of marriage, and it was amazing how little I actually needed to take with me. Most of the important stuff, the real estate holdings, the business interests, the bank accounts that actually mattered, those were all in my name anyway. "Where are you going?" she asked, following me with the kind of panic that meant she was finally understanding that apologies and flowers weren't going to fix this. "Away," I said simply, picking up my bag. "I'm done, Brooke. With you, with your family, with pretending that being treated like garbage is somehow normal in a marriage." I could hear her starting to cry behind me, but the sound didn't move me the way it used to. There's something about betrayal that burns away your capacity for misplaced sympathy, that teaches you the difference between genuine emotion and manipulative tears. My phone buzzed as I reached for the door handle. A text from Trevor, sent late last night after the reception had ended, a photo of him and Ava cutting the cake, both of them laughing with pure, unguarded joy. Below the image, he'd written, "Thank you. You were the real foundation of this celebration." I smiled and typed back, "Remember that. Never bite the hand that builds your world." His response came immediately. "Lesson learned. Travel safe, and thank you for teaching us what real strength looks like." I pocketed the phone and opened the door, stepping out into the hallway that led to the elevator, to the parking garage, to whatever came next. Behind me, I could hear Brooke calling my name, her voice echoing off the walls with the desperation of someone who'd finally realized what she'd lost. But I didn't look back. I'd spent 7 years looking back, making excuses, accepting scraps of respect from people who should have treasured what I brought to their lives. Now I was looking forward, toward a horizon that didn't include people who mistook kindness for weakness. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying me down toward ground level and a new beginning. Not as the uninvited husband, not as the family ATM, not as the quiet guy who could be safely ignored, but as the man who'd reminded them all that silent doesn't mean weak. Silent means watching. And when silent men finally move, the ground shakes beneath everyone who underestimated them.